Here's a sixth benefit. You end up allowing the Holy Spirit to take the gospel to people who have not heard it before, or even have not been regarded as deserving the gospel. Persecution smashes barriers. We've talked about this when speaking about the book of Acts. Persecution pushed the Jerusalem clique out to Samaria, to the Samaritans, and no one in their right mind in Jerusalem would have made a beeline to share the gospel with Samaritans if persecution had not propelled them outside the city. And we can see this even today. Out of the chaos in the Middle East, the Muslim background believer church is growing in a way that missionaries who lived and died in the region in previous generations dreamed of, but never saw. Seventh, you're forced to embrace the idea that everyone, including those who have not previously been empowered, is enabled to be an apostle of the gospel. Persecution levels hierarchies. It's a situation where the overlooked or the undervalued or the underused always get a job that they would not otherwise get. And I think in the future, we will learn wonderful things about categories of people that are so overlooked and underrated today. Take the work of amas or nannies in the Middle East. Most of them are humble Filipino Catholic maids, some of whom have raised princes with the stories and songs of the faith. Teaching a young child, Jesus bids me shine, in a household where mother and father do not even want to meet their child, but the maid delights in them, that goes a long way. Yet no one is more at the bottom of the pile in the society of the Middle East than a Filipina ama. It was another persecuted Christian that brought this home to me very clearly. Her name was Sister Anne. She's long dead. I met her in China way back in the mid-1980s. She was born into an educated family and had 4 brothers who all became doctors. She was not even taught, however, to read and write. She began to train as a nurse, but her father fell ill and she had to nurse him. Then her mother fell ill, she nursed her. That illness lasted 20 years. And then during her life, Sister Anne hardly ever left the house because no sooner had her mother died than one of her brothers fell ill, and she nursed him, and so it went on. And she was 82 years old when her last brother died, and all she had done with her life was to nurse her family members in her house in Shanghai. And as her last brother was dying, she wondered how she would live after he died. She'd no savings. The communists had taken all the wealth of the family. But the brother said to her, "Well, after I'm dead, look under the flagstone in the corner of the room." And she found many gold coins there. It was probably mafia money. Her brother had been connected with the criminal underworld. But that was in the distant past and nothing to do with her. So her future was assured. At 82, Sister Anne was suddenly free to do anything she wanted. The trouble was, though, she was old, she was illiterate, and she was beginning to feel ill herself. So she was a Christian and she approached some church leaders, but they had no use for her. She offered to give out tracts, but they said to her, "Well, you can't read. You might not give the appropriate ones to the right people." She couldn't teach the Bible because she'd never read it. So the leaders were not interested. "Just hand over the money," they said. "We'll make sure it builds the kingdom." She felt useless. Suddenly she made a decision. She said, "The one thing I always wanted to do was to travel. All my life had been spent inside my house by the bedsides of dying relatives. I'd never even been outside the city of Shanghai." And she thought, "Well, I know the gospel well. I can at least talk about it as I travel." So she became a traveling evangelist. She used the money to travel by train all over China. No one ever challenged her. She was just a harmless old woman. But she would travel first class, or as it was called then, soft sleeper. And she would just talk about Jesus to her traveling companions. And because she was in first class, many of them were high party officials. Some were outraged at her attempts to witness to them. But she said, well, what are you going to do? Throw an old lady off the train? More often than not, her companions would smile and listen to her and join her in conversation. She died at the age of 87. In the last 5 years of her life, she must have covered hundreds of thousands of miles. She went to the desert in the far northwest, ending up in Urumqi. She made it by bus to the 12,000 feet high Himalayan plateau in Tibet. And she went all the way down to the steamy jungles of the deep south, chattering about the gospel to anyone who would listen. I'd be surprised if in that entire time she slept more than 3 nights in the same place. She was too old to work for the house churches, or so those leaders thought, but she was not too old to work for God. Who else would have had the time just to travel on trains for 5 whole years? Who else but an old woman would have escaped arrest for witnessing about Christ all the time in public places to very high-ranking people? She did a unique work, but she never saw any fruit. She never fretted about the purpose of her life. Because persecuted Christians leave the future in God's hands and are content to live with a degree of bafflement or mystery that we would really struggle with very often in the West. What is God up to in my life? Persecuted Christians are not so curious. They believe it, they accept it. Years later, though, I met a house church Christian who was visiting the home of a very high-ranking Communist Party leader. And this person took a wrong turn in the compound, and he stumbled into a room where the wife of one of the major leaders of the entire country was sitting. And to his amazement, he saw that she was reading a Bible. And they talked, and she confessed that she was a Christian. And this was her story. She said, my husband was traveling to another city one day and was surprised to find in his train compartment an old woman who was coughing all the time from consumption. They talked a bit, and she told him all about Jesus Christ. And she said to him, this is why I'm traveling while I die. I have to spread the news. And this way, everyone comes to my deathbed. Well, my husband was very impressed, but he never became a Christian. But he told me the story, and I was really taken by that woman's dedication. And I thought, what is it about Jesus Christ that would compel her to travel all over China, even though she was dying? So I found a Bible, and I was saved. And her husband, despite formally professing communism, was always known to be a friend of Christians. And he worked hard to prevent the worst excesses of persecution being visited on them in the regions he controlled. Look at this amazing way that God worked. God builds his kingdom using an ill and expiring old lady traveling the country on mafia money to reach the powerful of the land with the gospel in a way that no one else could. So if God can use a sister Anne, he can use any one of us, and he will build the kingdom through us in ways that will make us marvel for all eternity, even though we may not see any of that at the time.